Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to be putting together a reader's guide to Neil Gaiman. This is a video that I have been hoping to do for a while because Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite fantasy authors, but he has a very extensive bibliography. He has been writing fantasy for a really long time, and I personally think that there are a bunch of different places where you can jump into his work. That being said, I know it can be intimidating to want to start a new author who has so much of a backlist to work through, and so I was hoping that this video would be helpful to you if you would like to get started with Neil Gaiman's works and you're not really sure where you would like to do that. I have thought a lot about what to do and what might be the best way to set this up. And what I have found to be the most helpful is to try to categorize his books. Neil Gaiman, along with being very prolific, is a very versatile author. He writes in a variety of styles and for a variety of age categories. He has written everything from picture books for children to children's novels to YA novels to adult fantasy novels. And I think that trying to link his books by genre or theme might work a little bit better in terms of laying them out for you rather than just going through them point by point. So I have kind of subdivided them into a bunch of different categories, and we'll talk a little bit about the different books within each of those categories. Before I do that, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview about what I think are Neil Gaiman's particular strengths and why I think that he is one of the very best authors working in fantasy right now. Neil Gaiman, whether for any of the books that I'm going to talk about in this video, there are some things that they all have in common. And those things would be the prose. Neil Gaiman has very beautiful but very accessible prose. It is lovely without ever being overly flowery. It is beautiful without ever feeling dense or difficult. It flows very well. It's almost musical in its quality. And I think that that makes it very, very easy to translate into audiobooks. So if you are an audiobook person, Neil Gaiman's books on audio are some of the very best, in my opinion. And what makes it even better is that he often narrates his own audiobooks, and he has an excellent speaking voice. He is an excellent narrator. So I think if you are someone who enjoys audiobooks, then he is definitely an author to try. So the prose, I think, links them all for sure. The imagination. Neil Gaiman, and I have said this in a bunch of my videos, is one of the most imaginative fantasy authors that I have ever read. His books have this almost whimsical quality. He builds up an atmosphere so well. His books feel immersive and they just feel magical. And that sounds it sounds very precious when you say it like that. It sounds almost trite, but it's true. He has a way of writing and he has a way of putting together stories that makes them feel like magic. And that is why I love his work so much. I feel like I am being transported into a magical world when I read something by him. So I really like that in writing, and I think that that is something that whatever you're reading by him translates throughout all of his work. It's something that is always there, regardless of the fact that if he's writing for children, if he's writing for adults, it doesn't matter. It all has that beautiful, whimsical quality, and I think that that is lovely. Another thing that you will get with Neil Gaiman that I think exists in pretty much all of his work is the ability to take very classic narratives and classic tropes and turn them on their heads. Whether this is in his nonfiction, whether this is in his fairy tale retellings, or whether this is in his own unique fantasy worlds, you will see a lot of trope subversion. You will see a lot of exploration of deep themes. You will see a lot of points that are available for discussion. So if any of those things appeal to you, if those are any of the things that you enjoy in fantasy, then I think you should definitely give Neil Gaiman's work a try. And I think that the following breakdown might make it a little bit easier for you to decide where to start. So we'll just break down his books into a couple of different categories. And this is just so that you can help organize his bibliography and decide where to start. There are a couple of noted exceptions to the list of books that I have put here. So I have not included his collaborative books, and I have not included his graphic novels. I may touch on some of those things in a future video, but for today we will be talking about the novels that he has written by himself. So the first category that I'm going to cover is his nonfiction. And the two books that I want to talk about here are The View from the Cheap Seats, which is a bind up of various speeches, forewords, letters, essays that he has put together and has written over the past 30 years or so. This is, I would think, something that would appeal more to a longtime fan of Neil Gaiman because it collects a lot of his thoughts and some notes about his writing process and different aspects of his life and his growth as an author. I think that they're interesting in their own right, but in order to really fully appreciate it, I think that you would have to be a fan of Neil Gaiman, or it may start to feel a little bit tedious or repetitive. The other work that I have put in the nonfiction category is his most recent release, which is Norse mythology. So this was released in 2017, and while it's not technically nonfiction, it does read like nonfiction in the same way that the collections of Greek mythology or other mythologies read. So I put it in the nonfiction category because I felt like the presentation fit that style. But this is Neil Gaiman's take on the Norse mythologies, on some of the very popular and well-known stories in Norse mythology. I personally listened to this one as an audiobook that Neil Gaiman had narrated himself, and it was a great experience. These are very introductory level stories. So if you are someone who is very well versed in Norse mythologies, if you have read the Poetic Eddas, if you have a very expansive knowledge of this subject matter, then I'm not sure how appealing this would be to you, because I think that it's best consumed by someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with this. But if you're someone like me who read The Shadow of the Gods this year and you really wanted to brush up on your knowledge of Norse mythology, then I think that this made a really worthwhile and really enjoyable storytelling time. The second category that I have grouped together here are urban fantasy novels. So the three books that I have chosen to put in this category include Neverwhere, American Gods, and Anansi Boys. So Neverwhere is a very straightforward urban fantasy. It's one of Neil Gaiman's earlier novels, but Anansi Boys and American Gods, which both take place in the same universe, with American Gods having been published first and Anansi Boys as a companion novel, these I would call more of a genre blend. But if I have to pick the category that fits them best, then I would say urban fantasy, because they do take place on Earth. They weave in elements of particularly mythological fantasy. Neil Gaiman touches on various mythologies within these books. And you do get an element of a road trip that takes place in American Gods. So I think that it definitely is a blend of a variety of genres, but urban fantasy is probably the place that it fits the best. The next category are his fairy tale or kind of whimsical retellings. And the three books that I have put in this category include Stardust and The Ocean at the End of the Lane and The Sleeper and the Spindle. Following that up, we have his short story collections, which I have outlined three here because these are the three that I have read. He does have an earlier bind up of short stories that I have never read, and I think there are a couple of anthologies that include his short stories, but along with the stories of other authors. So the three that I have talked about, or I'm going to talk about today, include Smoke and Mirrors, Fragile Things, and Trigger Warning. And then the final category here would be his children's novels. And those include Coraline, which was made into a really creepy stop-motion animated movie, The Graveyard Book, Odd and the Frost Giants, and Fortunately the Milk. So now that we've gone through those various categories, I'm going to give a brief overview of the books that are in each category, and I mean like a 1 or 2 sentence overview, and tell you which ones I feel like would make good entry points into Neil Gaiman's work. I'm going to do it this way, and I'm going to put in some timestamps because it takes some time to go through the various categories. And so if there is a particular book or books that you're interested in, you could kind of skip through the video and touch on the ones that are of interest to you. So I will start with the nonfiction because I think that one's the quickest one to get through, and there's not a lot more to say other than what I have said already. So we have The View from the Cheap Seats, which is basically a bind-up of some of Neil Gaiman's nonfiction writings. They include things from his blog posts, introductions for other authors' works that he has written, reflections on his own work and how his thoughts about it have changed over time, commencement addresses that he has made at various universities, New Year's wishes that he has written. So there's a variety of nonfiction works in this book. And I really do think that it's almost a love letter to those of us who really love Neil Gaiman's writing. I think that it's an excellent collection. I really enjoyed listening to it. I listened to it by audio, but I don't know how much someone who was not already a fan of Neil Gaiman would get out of that. Some of the topics are really interesting and his writing is lovely, but I really do think that this is something that's more suited toward somebody who is already a fan of his work and has been following him as an author. The other book that I talked about in this category was 2017's Norse Mythology, which is Neil Gaiman's spin on the Norse myths. These are some of the most common stories within Norse mythology. So again, if you're someone who's very well versed in these stories, then I don't necessarily think that you're going to get anything new or groundbreaking here. But if you're like me and you had a very basic working knowledge of Norse mythology and it's something that you want to explore a little further, then I think that this is a fantastic place to start. This is what I would call a really good entry-level introduction to the Norse myths before you want to dive into something like some of the sagas, something that's going to take a little bit more time or a little bit more effort. It will give you that background knowledge. It will introduce you to some of the terms, some of the names. And if you listen to it on audio, then someone else will be there to pronounce all those words for you, which is an excellent bonus in my opinion. But I think that it definitely is told in his kind of quirky style. So I think that it is a good introduction to his style of writing. So if you're looking for a book on that topic, then I think this is representative of the way that he writes, but not necessarily representative of the rest of his body of work. After the nonfiction category, we will go on to the urban fantasy novels that I talked about. So in this category, I had placed Neverwhere and then American Gods and Anansi Boys. So I think that Neverwhere, which is the basic setup for Neverwhere, is that you have a kind of regular everyday guy who runs into a damsel in distress and is pulled into an underground London to help her on a quest. It is your very quintessential urban fantasy novel. I think of all of Neil Gaiman's books, this is probably the most straightforward. This one does the least of kind of subverting tropes, and it feels the least unique of all of his novels, but I don't necessarily mean that as a bad thing. I think that you still get to see his imagination on great display. I think that the style of writing is still delightful, and I think that there are some genuinely creepy villains and creepy moments in this book. It is a solid introductory level urban fantasy novel. And as someone who doesn't, that's not my favorite subgenre of fantasy, I still really enjoyed Neverwhere. I would read Neverwhere again. So I think that it is definitely a fine place to start with Neil Gaiman. And I think if you start there, then you will get to see, because this is one of his earlier novels, as you read more of his work, you will get to see where he has grown and how I personally think he has improved over the years. So I think this is a great place to start, especially if you're interested in urban fantasy and you're looking for more of a straightforward narrative. The other two books that I put in this category are American Gods and Anansi Boys. And as I said, these are companion novels. They exist within the same universe, and there is some overlap in terms of character and theme. American Gods, I would say that most people would probably recognize this as Neil Gaiman's magnum opus, it's probably his best known work. I think that it has a lot of himself poured into it in terms of the themes that it explores. Neil Gaiman is a British author who has spent a lot of his life in America. And what American Gods is an exploration of American identity, what it means to be American, what it means to have a country that has been built from the influences of other cultures. And that is something that gets explored quite heavily in this book. And from everything to it's built basically on a road trip style setup, and it touches on roadside attractions and tourist traps, and it incorporates various mythologies. There's some heavy Norse mythology that influences it here, but there are characters that will pop up that you will recognize from other mythologies as well. And it blends them all together and shows us a landscape that feels very much like the America that the people who live there know, but it has that kind of unique fantasy flair. I think personally that this is an excellent selection for book club. There's a lot to really dive into. There's a lot to discuss in this novel. Of all of the books that I'm going to talk about today, this is probably the only one that I would not recommend as your introduction into Neil Gaiman, because I think that some of his kind of weirder concepts and ideas are present in this book. I think that it is a little more meandering. It's not as tight as some of his other novels, but I think if you already have an appreciation for his style, that you will really enjoy it. I think that there's a lot to appreciate in American Gods, but I personally would recommend it not being the place where you jumped into his work. And I say that having read that before any of his other work. American Gods was the first book that I read by Neil Gaiman, and I read it, explored more of his work, and then went back to reread it and really enjoyed it more the second time. This could also be because I was older and hopefully a little bit wiser the second time that I read it. But I do think that in terms of a jumping off point, this would not necessarily be the novel that I would choose first. And then of course, Anansi Boys is a companion novel, so I would recommend picking that up after you read American Gods. Shifting over to the category that I think is probably the most accessible in terms of his book, or his books, would be his kind of whimsical or fairy tale retellings. So the three books that I had put in this category included Stardust, and The Sleeper and the Spindle, and The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Stardust, I think, is the perfect place to jump into Neil Gaiman's work. This is his take on classic fairy tale tropes, on the classic fairy tale at large. He sets up what should feel like a very straightforward story, a very recognizable story, and he puts an imaginative spin on it that is quintessentially Neil Gaiman. This is the story of a young man who is in love with a woman in his village, and she sends him on a quest to retrieve a falling star. So if he can bring her back the falling star, then he can have her hand in marriage. So it's a very typical hero's quest. But what unfolds, I think, is not the typical fairy tale story. I think that there is a lot of heart in Stardust. It's a very short book, very accessible, very easy to read. And I thought it was absolutely so much fun. There was a movie that was released as well, which I also enjoyed. It's quite different from the book, but it was still enjoyable. And I think if you read the book, then you can also go and watch the movie and have a lot of fun with that as well. But from the writing style to the turns that the story takes to the characters, I think that these are all very indicative of Neil Gaiman's style. So I think that Stardust is an excellent place to start with his work. The second story that I want to talk about in this is The Sleeper and the Spindle, which is, I don't even know if it would qualify as a novella, to be honest. It's very short. It's like a long short story. And the bind up that I read is illustrated with some really beautiful illustrations by Chris Riddle, who works with Neil Gaiman in some of his children's books as well, who is a phenomenal illustrator. Just a great artist. And I think that the illustrations in this book go very well with the story. This is a retelling of both the Sleeping Beauty and Snow White fairy tales. And again, it has this very unique Gaiman spin on it that makes it so enjoyable. This is very accessible. I think it would give you a great indication of his style and the types of stories that he likes to write. And it's very, very short. So if you want to get a taste of Neil Gaiman, but you don't have a lot of space on your TBR or a lot of time to read something, then this would be an excellent place to start. The third book, and probably the most literary of Neil Gaiman's works, is the 2013 novel, The Ocean at the End of the Lane. This is a book that received a lot of critical acclaim when it was released. And the basic premise is that you have a man who is returning to his childhood home and has to come to terms with some experiences that he had there as a child. It's a book about growing up and what it means to grow up. And do we ever grow up? Do we ever escape the things that happened to us when we were children? It explores how we're molded by the things that happened to us as children. And it's very poetic in style. This is probably the most poetic of Neil Gaiman's works. It has his kind of quintessential, like whimsical writing style, but in terms of the actual narrative, the story, it feels much closer to magical realism than any of his other books. This is one that also, like American Gods, has a lot of thematic resonance. This is one that is worth diving into. It is an excellent one to buddy read, to chat about with your friends. This is a book that can probably be experienced in different ways by different people who have lived different childhoods. So it is a beautiful book. It is probably my favorite of his novels. I had a wonderful time reading this. I think that it is truly something special. It is, I think, a fine place to start with his bibliography, but it probably wouldn't be my recommendation. I think that Stardust is a lot more accessible than The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and that you could read that in anticipation or building up to The Ocean at the End of the Lane. But if you're someone who just wants to try Neil Gaiman and you really love Marquez and you really love magical realism and you love that blend of literary fiction and fantasy, then this is a fantastic place to start. I think that it is a superb novel and would love to chat with anybody who has read it because I had such a good time with it. The next category that I wanted to chat about are Neil Gaiman's short stories. So this is probably his work that I have built up the most on the channel. This is definitely what I have talked about at length. I've recommended in several recommendation videos because I love Neil Gaiman's short stories. I think that his short story collections are so imaginative. He has so many phenomenal ideas and they are so much fun to read. Sometimes I feel like short stories can leave you with a sense of dissatisfaction because you're just getting into a world and you want to know more, or you didn't quite get what you wanted out of the characters and you feel like you're reaching for more. And especially as fantasy lovers, we are so used to these giant multi-book series, these huge tomes, this intricate world building. But I will honestly say that I have never read a collection of Neil Gaiman's short stories and come away feeling dissatisfied. I have loved the 3 collections that I have read, and I think that they are the perfect starting point if you want to know more about Neil Gaiman's style. They aren't necessarily bound by theme. I think in the most recent one that I have read or that he has released, Trigger Warning, he does talk a little bit about the stories connecting to each other, but there's no really solid links from my experience of reading them. They all tend to have a standout short story that is a little bit longer. In Fragile Things, it's A Study in Emerald, which is a mashup of Sherlock Holmes and H.P. Lovecraft. So it's a Holmes mystery told with like a Lovecraftian flair. So it has that kind of eldritch tone to it. Fantastic short story. In Smoke and Mirrors, he has Snow Glass Apples, which is another one of his fairy tale retellings. And I believe in Trigger Warning, there is a short story that takes place in the American Gods universe. I would have to, I probably should have double checked, but I will write it in the description box. Or actually, I'll just pop up a little message up above. But I believe there's a short story in the Trigger Warnings bind up that is related to American Gods. So that wouldn't be the short story collection that I would start with unless you have read American Gods or you don't mind getting some of the background on those characters within that short story. My personal favorite short story by him is called Sunbird, and it is in Fragile Things. So that would be the short story collection that I would recommend starting with. But I think they're all great places to start. His short stories are so full of imagination, so enjoyable. They leave you feeling very satisfied, and I just think that they are an excellent place to start within his body of work. The very last category that I'm going to touch on is his children's novels. I know not everybody likes to read books for kids, but I think that Neil Gaiman's children's novels are some of those that transcend categorization. And I say that a lot. I feel like that's become like a catchphrase now. But I really think that it's true. I think that as an adult, you can still pick up the books that he has written for children and find a lot to enjoy. I also think that if you have kids who love fantasy, his books are so much fun to read aloud. I've talked about Fortunately the Milk on the channel before. So that is a story about a dad who has to go pick up some milk for his kids for breakfast. And when he is walking back from the store, he is abducted by aliens. And so begins a cross-time, cross-dimensional story about this poor dad trying to get home with this bottle of milk. It's really fun, very quirky. It can be read in a single setting or two settings. I have read this book probably like 8 times because my kids want to read it all the time, and it is really, really a lot of fun. The other really short children's story or children's book that he has is Odd and the Frost Giants, which is a story about a young Viking named Odd whose dad has passed away, and he feels very out of place within his family. He has an injury to his foot, so he has to walk with a cane, and because of that he's kind of looked down upon in his society. It's felt that he can't do some of the things that he is supposed to be able to do, and so he runs away from home up to his dad's wood carving cottage in the woods. And when he is there, he finds some animals who have some very special powers, and I won't say anything other than that, but this is kind of a Norse retelling for children. It's a great way to introduce kids to the idea of Norse mythology, to maybe get them interested in Norse mythology. And it's a very sweet, very enjoyable little book. So totally recommend that as well. Also a very short one, but it is a great time. His other 2 kids' books that are a little bit longer and a little bit creepier are Coraline and The Graveyard Book. So Coraline, I think, is pretty popular because of that stop motion animation film that was put out, but it's about a little girl named Coraline, and there is a door in her home that her parents say doesn't go to anywhere. It's just a false door. And Coraline is very curious about this door. So one day she tries to go inside, and when she opens it, she finds a pathway to an alternate version of her home. And in this other home is her other family, including her other mother. And while she is welcomed into this home by the other mother, there is soon a very sinister tone that takes over the book, and Coraline finds that it may not be as easy to return to her house as she once thought. So this is a very creepy little story. I haven't watched the movie because I honestly think it would scare me because my barometer for getting scared is so low, but it was really enjoyable. It has some very creepy little illustrations. If you have kids who like a good little scare, I think this would be a great book for them. And it's just a fun book to read. I read it not with my kids because they inherited my bravery, which is to say that they're scared of almost everything. So I haven't read it with them, so I can't give any personal feedback for that. But I think that it's a really enjoyable and fun little story. And then the final book in the children's category is The Graveyard Book, which is another one of Neil Gaiman's retellings, and it is based on one of his favorite novels, which is The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. So just like the story in The Jungle Book tells the story of Mowgli, who is raised in the jungle by jungle animals, we have the story of Bod, who is raised in a graveyard by ghosts. So his parents have been killed at the beginning of the novel, and he escapes to this graveyard and has to grow up amongst the ghosts. And I really, really enjoyed this. This is a great story, especially if you love The Jungle Book. I'm a really big fan of The Jungle Book, and I really enjoyed this retelling. I think if you want to get an introduction into the more whimsical style of Neil Gaiman, if you like middle grade stories, then this is definitely a fantastic place to start. If you don't like middle grade stories, then that's fine. There are tons of other books that I have just gone through that would be excellent starting points as well. But of his children's books, I think Fortunately the Milk has to be my favorite because it's the one that I've had the most fun reading with my kids. But I think The Graveyard Book is the best of them all. I think that this is his strongest work of children's fiction and is highly enjoyable for readers of any age. But that is the overview of Neil Gaiman's works. If you like all of these subcategories, all of these types of fantasy, and you just want to know, what should I read? Tell me which book to read first. I don't think that you could go poorly by starting with Neverwhere or Stardust or Fragile Things. Those would probably be my top 3 suggestions for where to start with Neil Gaiman. I think that those are 3 of his most accessible books. I think that they are pretty representative of his style, but you'll still have lots to explore and lots to discover by him if you start there and kind of work your way back through his backlist. I think that Neil Gaiman is a fantasy author that should be at least attempted by everyone. He has a very experimental style. I think that his books are perfect for buddy reads, for book clubs. They are so much fun to dive into, to delve into. They offer so much to the reader, and I think that there is so much to gain by reading them. If you are a Neil Gaiman fan and you have personal preference for where to start or books that you think are best for people to start with, then please let me know below. Let me know what your favorite book by Neil Gaiman is. I would love to hear from some more people who enjoy his work. And I hope that you found this video to be helpful in terms of finding a place to start. I will remember to timestamp everything so that you can kind of fit through it all. And I look forward to chatting with you about Neil Gaiman. I'll see you with another video soon. Bye.